Ready? Okay, this week's Sedra Parshas Emor, and of course, Emor discusses the holidays, the regalim, mentions Shabbos together with them, but it also discusses the mitzvahs of Sefiras Omer, which we are presently involved with. So it's probably appropriate to discuss Sefiras Omer. Now, all kinds of reasons are offered to explain Sefiras Omer. One reason offered to explain Sefiras Omer is that Sefiras Omer is because the Jewish people asked Moshe Rabbeinu when they're going to get the Torah. When they left Egypt, they asked them when they're going to get the Torah, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to reveal himself to them. So Moshe said in 50 days, so they started counting 49 days until they got to the 50th day. So it's a sort of re-experiencing what happened, what the Jewish people did after they left Egypt. Others say, I mean, all the reasons could be true. Others explain Sefiras Omer on the basis of linkage, of linking Pesach, Shavuos to Pesach. And there are aspects, we began to discuss it, we'll probably discuss it more today. The linkage tells us something, Shavuos reveals to us something about Pesach, and Pesach certainly reveals something about Shavuos. And that's probably what we're going to focus on today. And then there's a third reason that's given. We probably won't discuss it today. This is the reason suggested by the Mekubalim, from the mystical tradition, and that is that when somebody is tamei, when someone is tamei, so they have to wait very often, whether it's tumas nida, whatever, some of the tumos. So they have to count 7 clean days, so to say, before they go to the mikveh. For some reason, here it's 7. So figuratively, we became tamei, we became contaminated in Egypt. The Jewish people became contaminated in Egypt. So they, in order to for them to understand that they had to undergo a process of tahara, a process of purification before they received the Torah, so they had to count 7 weeks. Okay, but I'm going to focus on the connection between Pesach and Shavuos. Now, our sages tell us that, and between Yetzias Mitzrayim, between the Exodus, between the Exodus and the giving of the Torah. Our sages tell us in the Gemara Menachos, mitzvah l'mimnei yoma, mitzvah l'mimnei shavua. There is a mitzvah to count the days, and there's a mitzvah to count the weeks. In other words, on one hand, we say, Hayom Yom Echad Bomer, Hayom Shnei Yomim Bomer. Today is 1 day in the count of the Omer. Today is 2 days in the count of the Omer. But then when we come to 7 days, we say Hayom Shiva Yomim. Today is 7 days. Shehem Shavu Echad, that they are 1 week in the count of the Omer. And then on the 8th day, there is a machlokes. Whether on the 8th day we say, we just say Hayom Shmona Yomim, today is 8 days. And then on the 14th, again, we count, today is 14 days, which is 2 weeks. In other words, according to some Rishonim, perhaps most Rishonim, and that is not in accordance with our custom, we only count the weeks on the 17th, on the 7th, the 14th, the 21st, etc. However, our custom is in accordance with the Shita that once we hit the 7th day, So we continue counting, even on the 8th and the 9th, the weeks. In other words, when you get to the 8th day, you say, Hayom Shmona Yomim. Today is 8 days, which is 1 week and 1 day in the count of the Omer. So, but whatever the case is, there is a mitzvah to count the days of the Omer as well as the weeks of the Omer. And the question is, from a hashkafa perspective, why it is that way? The Torah says, on one hand, Torah says, Tispru Chamishim Yom, and Shiva Shavuos Tispru Lach. So we have to count 7. We have to count 7 weeks, and we have to count 50 days. 50 days means 49 days. I'm not getting into explaining that right now. Until the 50th day, or until the 50th day. So there is a mitzvah of counting days and counting weeks. And the question is, why was it so significant of counting both days and weeks? Why was it necessary to count weeks as well? And now, this is not the only mitzvah of counting. We know, at least according to some Rishonim, there is a mitzvah on the Bezdin, on the High Court of Israel, the Bezdin Hagadol, Sanhedrin, to count the years. To count the years. In other words, because every 7th year is a Shemitah year. And in the Shemitah year, one is not allowed to work the land in Israel. There are all kinds of laws that are associated with the 7th year. So they would count. The Ramban discusses it. He seems to have a doubt, but he's inclined that way. The Rambam is explicit that way. From Tosas, it doesn't appear that way, but you count the years, you count the individual years. This is 1 year in the cycle till you get to the 7th year, and then when the 7th year, you say, this is the 7th year, which is the Shemitah year, which is the first year of the cycle, because you have seven Shemitah years in the 50-year period. So that's 49 years. And then the 50th day, the 50th year, that's the Jubilee year, the Yovel year. So what we do with Sefira, the Bezdin Hagadol would do, the High Court of Israel would do with the years in the Shemitah, in the Shemitah Yovel Jubilee process. Okay, but there we understand it, because there are special halachas, special laws that apply to the Shemitah year. The work in the Shemitah year in Israel was not allowed to be done. So we understand the significance of counting the 7th year in a special manner as well. And these 7 Shmitos lead us to the 50th year, which is the Jubilee year, which also has many halachas, many special laws concerning it. But the question is, why did the halacha, or instead of why, what is the halacha impressing us when the halacha requires, in regard to the Sefiras Omer, that we should count the days and the weeks? There's nothing special. There's nothing special about the seventh day, other than we say, which is one, other than saying, which is 1 week in the Omer. So why is it? What is the idea? What are we supposed to learn out from the fact that the Torah said it's not enough to count 50 days or 49 days, but you have to count the weeks as well? As a matter of fact, the very fact that the holiday of Shavuos, which is the 50th day after we start the count, is called Chag HaShavuos, the holidays of the weeks, signifies how important the counting of the weeks is. So we have to understand, what is the lesson to learn from the fact that the Torah gives such significance to the counting of the weeks? And in the expression, the Gemara in Menachos, mitzvah l'minne yomei, mitzvah l'minne shvuei. There's a mitzvah to count the days, and there's a mitzvah to count the weeks. There is a discussion among the poskim that, let's say somebody, according to the opinion that if you miss one day, you no longer have a mitzvah. If somebody forgot to count in the first 6 days, whether he can start counting on the 7th day as well with a bracha, because while the count of the days ceased to be a real count because he missed one day, but the count of the weeks continues, and it could be, according to some, it's like a separate part of the mitzvah or another mitzvah. So there is a discussion about it. The Reb Chaim and the Beis Halevi felt that if somebody missed one of the 6 days from when he counts the weeks, he can also make a bracha. The Beis Halevi's opinion was on the 7th and on the 14th and on the 21st, he can make a bracha. However, Reb Chaim felt even on the 8th and 9th, since he counts the weeks on the 8th and the 9th, he can make a bracha. Even if he missed, let's say, the 5th day, because there's a new count there. There's a count of the weeks. However, if you take a look at the third chelik of the Torah's Rafal, which was written by Reb Rafal Shapiro, who was the father-in-law of Reb Chaim. So he has a responsa there, which is addressed to his brother-in-law, Reb Chaim Berlin, in which he says, no, if you miss one day, even in the first week, so the mitzvahs of the days and the weeks are tied one to the other. And in the Rishonim, we see there's a discussion. Let's say you missed one day, you missed counting the weeks, and you only counted the days. You counted the days, and whether you can continue counting or not. So, but the simple explanation is that to a certain degree, they are tied one to the other, whether halachically or from a hashkafa standpoint. That's a separate question, but there is a connection. I want to understand why it's so important after counting the days that the Torah requires us to count the weeks. Now, why we call it, it's called Sefiras Omer. The bracha we make is Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al Sefiras Omer. The Omer sacrifice was a sacrifice of barley that was given. It was given in it was given on the second day of Pesach. The barley was cut the night of the second day of Pesach, and that's when we started counting. That's when we started counting the Omer. The Omer is we begin the count of the Omer from the second night of Pesach. So the question is, but what is the lesson? What is the idea behind the mitzvah of the Omer? In other words, because you're not allowed to eat any of the new grains being the grains that took root since the previous second day of Pesach. So until the following second day of Pesach. And when they gave the carbon of the Omer on the second day of Pesach, that may remove the prohibition against eating the new grains. Today, according to most opinions, the Rambam disagrees, the prohibition of chadash, of eating new grains, is only rabbinic, because the biblical prohibition of eating chadash is only when the Beis Hamikdash was in existence, only when they gave the carbon of the Omer, when the Omer sacrifice was required to be given. Okay, but in any case, but what's the idea behind the carbon of the Omer? The way most of the Mefarshim explain the carbon Omer, in other words, all the way down through the Meshech Chachma, who very much emphasizes this reason, the idea behind the carbon Omer is that when we have things that grow, whether it's because of nature or because of our hard work, there is a tendency not to see that it's something that came from God. The Meshech Chachma emphasizes it's the fact that man was involved, and where a person is involved, so he takes either unconsciously or consciously, I did this. You see, this land that grew so much. You know why it grew so much? Because I worked, I toiled. And even without that, then some of the Mefarshim don't emphasize the toil and labor of the farmer. But things that are there all the time, that's part of nature, physical nature. So we have a tendency to take it for granted. And we don't realize consciously that it's really God who gave it to us, because it's always there. I mentioned time and time again, why is it the Jews saw so many miracles in the desert and they're constantly rebelling against God? How are we to understand it? But the answer is, when you constantly have these miracles, when you see the man coming down every day, you begin to take it for granted. So it's important that as we begin, first of all, until the sacrifice of the Omer was given, it was important to realize that I had no right to cut the Omer, to cut the grains. I had no right to harvest the grains. I had no right to eat the grains, because it all belongs to God. And then when I gave the carbon of the Omer, the barley sacrifice, when I gave that to God, so that was an indication that I recognized, and I'm giving thanks to God. Thanks to God for the grain that I'm harvesting. Recognition that, yes, I might have worked on it. Yes, it's always here. But it's only because God is always there. And it's an act of recognition, of thanking God and recognizing that He's the one that gives it to us. And I've mentioned many times about with Amalek. Why did Amalek attack the Jewish people? As our sages tell us, "Ein shmi shalem ve'ein kisi shalem, ad sheyamach Hashem Amalek min olam." My name is not complete, and my kisei, my throne, is not complete, so long as Amalek is in the world. What was the ideology of Amalek that prevents God's name from being complete, that prevents God's throne from being complete? The ideology of Amalek is non-recognition of God. And the reason Amalek attacked the Jewish people, of course, there was hatred of the Jewish people, but more than the hatred of the Jewish people was the hatred of God. Milchama la'Hashem ba'Amalek midor dor. There is a war against Amalek from generation to generation, an internal battle. So what's the idea? The idea behind it is because Amalek doesn't want recognition, doesn't want the world to recognize God. What's shmi, shame? That's recognition. Vayeshem lemelech al kol haaretz, and we look at the end of days, God will be king over the whole world. By Yom Hahu yeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad. Everybody will recognize God. Shmo, when you recognize, name has to do with recognition. So recognition of God, that will be when Amalek is not there, because Amalek, the Amalekius, the philosophy, the ideology of Amalek is non-recognition of God. So Moshe Rabbeinu, when he went up to the mountain in the war of Amalek, he raised his hands in prayer. Why did he raise his hands in prayer? Because the Jewish people were fighting against Amalek. Till now, the Jewish people sat back. Till now, the Jewish people, everything, the Sefiras Makos, the 10 Makos, that the Jewish people didn't do anything. Even Kriyas Yamsuf, so Nachshon ben Rinadav ran into the Yam, into the sea, and it split. But it was clearly supernatural. There was no other way of possibly understanding it. But with the war against Amalek, the Jewish people fought. So there will be a tendency. I did it myself. So the victory of the Jewish people had to be associated with the prayer of Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu raised his hands in prayer so the Jewish people could see it. The Jewish people were fighting the battle. So they should be able to identify their victory with Moshe's prayer. And when Moshe put down his hands, the governor Amalek at the edge. So that's the reason why. The same thing is true with the Korban Omer. The idea of the Korban Omer is either because of man's involvement in planting and in sowing and in reaping and in harvesting, or because it's always there. Nature's there. It's part of nature. Person won't recognize that it's God, or he tends to focus on nature, not to focus on God. So because of that, the Korban Omer came. Now, but what is the idea? What is the idea of the counting? The counting of the counting of the 7 weeks. Now, the creation is identified with number 7. Nature is identified with the number 7. Brias Olam was over a 7-day period, a 7-day cycle. So we could suggest that part of the idea was to emphasize, and one of the arguments, in other words, we want to associate the Sefiras Omer is to associate the harvesting period, with to associate the harvesting period with the miracles of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the Exodus. It's interesting, when Moshe Rabbeinu went up to the mountain and he raised his hands in prayer, he says, "Umate Elohim biyadi." The staff of God is in my hands. What was the staff of God? The staff of God was the staff with which Moshe Rabbeinu brought the miracles, the Aseres Hamakos. In other words, you should know the message was, when you look up, you Jewish soldiers, you look up to the mountain and you see Moshe Rabbeinu in prayer, and the staff of God is in his hand, you should know your victory is miraculous. Yes, you are fighting, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu is empowering you. And it's as much the deeds of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what God did, as was Yetzias Mitzrayim, where you sat back and you did nothing and just were the recipient of God's help. And in a sense, that's what we have to do. We have to transfer those miraculous, the recognition of the miraculous, and bring it into nature. It's very interesting, the Likutei Torah of the Baal Tanya, when he talks about the sin of the Meraglim, he says, what was it that the Meraglim, what was the mistake of the Meraglim? Why did the Meraglim make this mistake? He says that the Meraglim felt that in the desert there were more miracles than there was in Eretz Yisrael. It wasn't like Egypt, but in the desert you had the man coming down every day. There was a greater ability to sense the hand of God in their daily lives. And they realized that once they enter Eretz Yisrael, once they land to the land of Israel, so the challenges of recognizing the hand of God in our lives would become much greater. And they did not want that task of recognizing God. They wanted to be able to easily feel, sense the presence of God. So, but what is our challenge? The challenge is to take the miraculous, to take the unusual events where it's obvious, the hand of God is obvious, and to transfer that into our daily lives as well. And I think the seven weeks, what is the significance of the week? The week represents creation, because Brias Olam was creation. The Maharal and even to the Ramban, and to a certain degree also, says that 7 represents the physical world. Nature represents nature, whereas 8 is above nature. And he says that the 7 weeks we count, that represents nature. Shavuos, which comes after Shavuos, which comes after the 7 weeks, that's above nature. That's Matan Torah. That's above nature. And of course, that could be understood very easily, because even though there were miracles in the desert, the greatest miracle of all was the miracle of Matan Torah, because Matan Torah defies nature. The Rambam's opinion, most of the Mefarshim disagree with the Rambam, that to a certain degree, the miracles, all the miracles were, so to say, programmed into creation. But it seems that is not true about Matan Torah, because God appearing to the Jewish people and giving the Torah, that was beyond nature completely, couldn't be programmed in. So, but in any case, so the idea, the 7 weeks represent nature. The 7 days represent nature. But the question is, why do we need 7 weeks to represent nature when we have 7 days that represent nature? Why is it that we have to count 7 days times 7? And I think The answer is very simple. The answer is because the reason we have to count 7 times 7 is the reason we have to count the Rambam in discussing the days of Pesach and the days of Sukkot. So he says, why was it necessary for these holidays to be 7 days? Why was it, especially in regard to Pesach, he says, why was it necessary to have 7 days of Pesach? The Rambam explains that the whole purpose that Pesach, and to a certain degree, the significant part of Pesach, according to the Rambam and Emor is the first day. We eat the matzah, we eat the carbon Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice. And he says the prohibition of chametz is in order to give significance to the eating of matzah. In other words, because if you were allowed to eat chametz together with matzah, shbachol oleilos, anu ochlin chametz u'matzah. So then the matzah wouldn't have special recognition. The matzah would be another form of bread. But matzah makes an impact on us because we're not allowed to eat bread. We're not allowed to eat chametz. That's how the Rambam explains the prohibition of chametz. There are other explanations as well. The prohibition of chametz on Pesach. So he says, so why is it that we're prohibited from eating chametz for 7 days? He says, because something that's just one day doesn't make a lasting impression. And the purpose of Pesach is not just that we should undergo something at that moment. As I mentioned, in the Haggadah, we say, Rabbi Yehuda, Hayanosein Behem Simonim, when they talk about the 10 makos, the 10 plagues. So Rabbi Yehuda would give signs. He would take the first word of each of the makos, of each of the plagues, the tzach, hadash, b'achab. Big Shmuel, so what's the significance of it? I need Rabbi Yehuda to tell me that. I could take it myself. But in other words, because when we teach our children about Yetzias Mitzrayim, about the Exodus, when we teach them about the 10 makos, we don't want to just tell them a story. It's chinuch. We're teaching them. We want it to last with them. And a young child doesn't remember. So we give him ways of remembering. The tzach, hadash, b'achav, dam, tzvadei, akinim. This is where he should remember. The purpose of these holidays that commemorate Yetzias Mitzrayim, that commemorate the Exodus, is that it should have a lasting impression. 7 days, the Rambam says, is a natural amount of time, 7 times, in order to create a lasting impression. So I think what's said about the 7 days, it's the concept of 7 emphasizes creation. But in order that the idea of creation, and creation emphasizes God nature. But our requirement is not enough to see God in creation. We have to remember, because as we move further and further away from creation, and we see the world being governed by what appears to us by the laws of causation, by the laws of nature. So somehow God becomes hidden. As I mentioned many times, the Mekubalim say that nature is a curtain that sometimes tends to hide God. On one hand, the Rambam tells us that we have to look into nature in order to see the hand of God. On the other hand, the nature hides God. Nature can be viewed from two perspectives. If we try to understand, if we use nature as a curtain, then we hide God. And that's why sometimes it became necessary for miracles, because God became hidden. Hidden not because he hid himself, because we hid God. So this is the so we have to associate the breaking of nature, and it's very interesting. We have Asara Maimoros. This is pointed out, the Sfasemis, other Mekubalim, Asara Maimoros, the 10 expressions with which God created the world, correspond with the Asara Makos, with the 10 plagues that God brought on Egypt, because the Sarah Maimaros, that represents nature. The 10 Makos represents the breaking of nature. But the idea of the breaking of nature is in order to recognize God in nature. And and it's very interesting. I think I saw the name of the Rambam, could be it's Emor Nevuchim. The famous question Rashi and the Ramban ask: why is it that the Torah starts off with Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz? Why does the Torah start off with creation? And it's brought down in the name of the Rambam that the reason the Torah starts off with Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz, because man initially comes to recognize God by looking at nature. How did Avraham Avinu come to recognize God? The whole world ignored God. How did Avraham Avinu come to recognize God? But Avraham came to recognize God by looking at nature. He said, is it possible that there is a bira, that there is a house, a mansion with light and everything, and there's no one in it? Who made the house? Who's living in the house? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Medrash says, figuratively sticks his head out of the house and he says, Ani Baal Habira. I am the master of the house. And Avraham Avinu looked at the world. In other words, when we want to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we have to search for God. And if we don't want to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we don't search for him. Then nature becomes a curtain that hides God. Now, and it's interesting, Pesach, perhaps more than any other holiday, focuses on this. And it could be that perhaps this is the reason why Pesach comes in the Chodesh HaAviv, in the springtime. The springtime represents the beginning of nature, the renewal of nature. Well, very simple, that we could suggest that the renewal of nature, the whole idea of the renewal of nature is because the Jewish people have to renew themselves constantly. So their becoming a nation becomes identified with nature, which constantly renews itself in springtime. But we could say there's an additional reason. The reason it's Chodesh Aviv because we want to identify nature with Yetzias Mitzrayim. As a matter of fact, Reb Chaim would say that there is a halacha that Yetzias Mitzrayim, that the Pesach has to be in Chodesh Aviv. He says it's not because the Exodus happened in Aviv, happened in springtime. On the contrary, he says God made God made Yetzias Mitzrayim, made the Exodus in springtime because he wanted the celebration of Pesach to be in springtime. Why did he want the celebration of Pesach to be in springtime? But I think a springtime, which represents the renewal of nature, the beginning, so to say, the new beginning of nature, he wanted that identified with the miracles of Pesach. In other words, to see the hand of God in nature itself. Now, so what I think is that, in a sense, the seven weeks, in other words, we observe the 7 weeks because we have to impress upon ourselves the idea of nature before we go into Matan Torah. But we have to impress ourselves with God being in nature, because God reveals himself only when man searches for him. Now it's very interesting. The Rambam in it tells us the mitzvah of Anochi Hashem, belief in God. So he laid that to know. Shehu Matzi Rishon, he was the first. And everything that's in this world was created by God. Now, and the Ram says Leida, to know. What's the idea of Leida? Leida, as I mentioned, many said that it means philosophical proofs. My uncle said, no, Leida means to experience God. In other words, when we look at nature, when we look at the sun going up, so we shouldn't just see the sun going up. We see God raising the sun. We have to experience God in everything we see. And a matter of fact, when it comes to Avas Hashem, there seems to be a contradiction between the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvos and the Rambam in Yad HaChazaka. The Rambam in Yad HaChazaka in Perek Beis says, what's the mitzvah of Avas Hashem? How does one come to love God? He says, when you look, b'maisav ruav haneflaim, in his deeds and his creations, special creations, great creations, and you see the chachma that was involved in it. So then the Rambam certainly knew science, certainly from the science of his day. So we see the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that leads one to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. However, if you take a look in the Sefer HaMitzvos, Mitzvah Gimel, so the Rambam says there, Shenizbonen v'niskal mitzvosav upulosav. There's another girsa, v'niskal mitzvosav umaimara v'pulosav. We have to understand, to focus, and to understand. You have to look at and understand. Both are involved. If you just look at nature, nature becomes a curtain. But if you try to understand nature, so nature is more than just a curtain. Then you come to see the hand of God. Then you are following in the direction of Avraham Avinu. And Avraham Avinu came to recognize God through nature. So So the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvos, so he says V'naskil mitzvosav polosov. So the question many ask is, how come in Sefer HaMitzvos the Rambam mentions both mitzvosav, his mitzvos, and his deeds, and according to the Girsa that the Chinuch has, the Maimorav, and his expressions, and in the Yad HaChazaka, he doesn't mention looking at the mitzvos, looking at what he said, looking at the Torah. It just says focusing on nature. She is born Adam b'maisa b'vruav hanefloim. So it focuses on Maisav, his deeds, uvruav hanefloim. Why is it that the Rambam here doesn't mention to be looking at Maimorav, to focus on what he told us, to focus on his mitzvos, to seek out God, the Torah? So why is it that the Rambam in Yad HaChazaka doesn't? So my father said that because the Rambam here says the Maisav, and Maisav has reference to the Torah also, because the Torah refers to the Luchos as the Maisalakim thing, something that was done by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because God engraved the Luchos. I think there's a simpler answer, and that is because if you take a look at the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, Perek Yud of Hilchos Tshuva, so the Rambam says that in regard to mitzvos and Torah, so a person should do it lishma. And the Rambam defines, there seems to be a machlokus between the Rush and the between the Rush and the Rambam. What does Torah lishma mean? Mitzvos lishma, there is no argument. Mitzvos lishma means that I do the mitzvahs because of dveikis to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because I want to feel God, close to God. But the Rambam Shita is that learning Torah lishma is like the other mitzvahs also. It's dveikis, feeling close to God. So the Rambam mentions it in Perek Yud. The Rambam mentions it in Perek Yud. So in a sense, a person has to see God, has to cut the way of obtaining love of God is focusing on nature and focusing on the deeds that God does in the world. When you look at history, you can study history as dates. You can study history as the names of kings. But you can study history and see the hand of God in history. In other words, if you just read history books, you just get facts, then you do not fulfill the mitzvahs. But we have to look back at time. And it's very interesting when it comes to Sefiras Omer. How does the Sefiras Omer say? We don't say today is the first day of the Omer, today is the second day of the Omer. But we say today is the first. Today is one day in the Omer. Today is 2 days in the Omer. In other words, when I count on the second day, today is 2 days. Yesterday is part of today. Our experiences of the past have to be brought into the future. The experiences of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, the experiences of being set free of the Eser Makos, the miraculous experience have to be brought with us. And it has to be brought with us, not just to other miraculous events, not just in Matan Torah, but the experience has to be brought to us when we don't have as many miraculous events. The 50 days. Yes, there were miracles in the Midbar that was necessary to sustain the Jewish people. And these were miracles that repeated themselves and almost became nature for the Jewish people. But we have to take the experience of Yetzias Mitzrayim and perhaps the expectation of Matan Torah and put it into those days in between, those days that don't have unusual events, that have events that repeat themselves day after day after day. Yes, there was the Kriyas Shamsuf also. But this is the idea of the 50 days, the 7 times representing creation. But creation is not just important to focus on creation as a past event. We have to take the events of creation and bring it into the present time, and bring it and identify the miracles of creation with the miracles of Yetzias Mitzrayim, with the Exodus from Egypt. And it's I think so. I think now it's important. It's not only that you start out to recognizing God, as Avram did, through nature, to see God in nature. But I think even after Matan Torah, even after one is involved in Torah, one should focus. It doesn't mean that you have to read science books after you learn. It won't do any harm. But especially if you have the proper hashkafas, because you'll see HaKadosh Baruch Hu more and more. But in other words, because you have to be on guard when it comes to nature. Nature can be a curtain that hides God. So you have to have a special attitude. So after you learn Torah, or while you're learning Torah, if you look at nature also, so you begin to see the hand of God in nature more clearly than you would otherwise. So the idea is, when we go to Yetzias Mitzrayim, when we experience the Exodus, when we do the Chayav Adam Liros Satzmo, Kilu Hu Yotzam Mitzrayim. So when we do all of that, so we go back in time. The idea of Sefiras Omer is to take those past events and bring it into the present. Bring it with us. That's the idea. Hayom Shnei Yomim Bomer, Hayom Shlosha Yomim Bomer. The past becomes part of the present. We don't pass through time as a person going on a train passes through cities. But he has to bring the past into the present. That's part of the idea of Sefiras Omer, is in a sense becoming a master of time, of taking the past and bringing it into the present. Bringing it into the present doesn't mean that it should only be a history, to know history. You see, I have people that will start quoting all kinds of dates. That's meaningless. But the question is the impact of history, the impact of Brias Olam. None of us were there, but we have to take the events of Brias Olam. When we focus, when we look back at Brias Olam, when we look back at creation, and when we look back at creation, we see the hand of God. We have to bring that into the present, where the hand of God is not so obvious, unless you try to search and see, unless you try to see the hand of God. So this is the mitzvah, and this brings us to Avas Hashem, to love of God. Now, certainly, when you start people who had no exposure to Torah. So they Baruch Hamakom, Baruch Hu, Umakomo Sholam. So when you deal with a Sheni Odei Lisho, a child who has no background, so you try to explain to him that the world was created by God. Umakomo Sholam. He's the one that created the world. But then Baruch Shenasan Torah Lamu Yisrael. But you go to from there to Baruch Shenasan Torah Lamu Yisrael. But we still have to know Baruch Hamakom, because the more we learn Torah, the more we could see the hand of God. And how sages tell us, it's said in the Sifrei Kabbalah, I mentioned the 10 Maimaros, the 10 expressions with which God created the world, correspond with the 10 Makos and correspond with the Aseres Hadibros, with Matan Torah, with Shavuos. What's the idea? It's Sof Ma'aseh b'machshava tchila, because the Torah, the Zohar tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is stakil b'taraso u'bolo bara olamo. God looked in the Torah and created the world. In other words, through the study of Torah, yes, initially we see God through creation. Baruch HaMakom, Baruch Hu. But even after it's Baruch Shenasan Torah Lamo Yisrael, we still have to say Baruch HaMakom, because we get a clearer perspective, because now we're learning the blueprint that God used to create the world. After we learn Torah, we can see God clearer, more clearly. So when we Shavuos, when we prepare ourselves for Shavuos, we focus on nature, because as a result of learning the Torah, we will have a better understanding of the hand of God in nature. Okay.
Before we do questions, we want to mention that the next 2 weeks, we're not going to be able to have share live. So we are going to record them, and you can see them on YouTube. And here are the 2 of the links that you could get them on YouTube. So that's for the next 2 weeks. We will not have share on Sunday morning, but we would hope to, God willing, pre-record this year. If anyone has any questions right now on the share, please put them in the chat. So I don't see any questions here, but thank you everyone for joining us. For all the mothers there, happy Mother's Day. And God willing, in 3 weeks, we'll be back here on the regular time with the regular Zoom link. Have a good weekend.